Welcome to Contractors, and today we're going to be discussing some C# questions that you will be asked for on your interview. Don't screw up on getting that six-figure salary because you didn't know something like this, like what I'm about to show you, and be sad about it. It's happened to me before where I've lost an interview because I couldn't answer some of the basic questions that they sent out, or some questions that just blindsided me and I just didn't know. This is one of those questions. This question involves interfaces and abstract classes. You're going to get asked this question a lot when you go into your interview, so don't miss out on this. So what's the question going to be? What's going to happen is that when you go into your interview, they're going to quiz you on the basic tenets of C#, of the C# language. Interfaces and abstract classes are very, very important when you're writing code. When you use interfaces and abstract classes, they make your code much more reusable and less redundant and much more manageable. So that's very important to writing good code. Especially if you're paying someone six figures, I will want you to write good code and I want you to use these techniques. However, interfaces and abstract classes are one of those things that are kind of difficult to explain, and what happens is that people explain them by giving you the syntax first and then expecting you to understand what they are off the bat. But I'm not gonna do that here. What I'm gonna do instead is I'm gonna give you some basic definitions of what you need to know in order to understand, to answer the question of what is an abstract class, what is an interface, how are they different, how are they, what can you use them for, to ask you some variation of these questions. In this video, I'm going to separate the content by giving some definitions that you will need to know to understand them fully. Then I'm going to give you some real world examples of how to treat an abstract class and interface, for your own mental organization, let's say, mental context. And then finally, I'll give you some syntax examples. I'm not going to go too in-depth into the syntax examples, but I believe that with everything that you're going to gain from this video, if you go in and find some more examples on your own, they'll only reinforce your knowledge without getting too lost in the weeds, which is not something you want to do. So let's get started. Polymorphism. Polymorphism is usually asked along with this question, so be prepared to answer it. But this isn't a polymorphism video. This is just interface abstract video. But because I know that in my experience they always ask this with your interface and abstract class questions, it's good to know the definition nonetheless. So poly means many and morph means form. Oops. So what does that mean for you? It means that you have the same method that can be used for many tasks. That's what that means. So whenever they ask you that question, just answer it in that way. The second thing you gotta learn is inheritance. Inheritance is really important for this topic specifically because you'll be inheriting your abstract classes and your interfaces throughout, that's how you use them. So an inheritance means that they are just the ability that your classes have to take on fields and methods of other classes. So if you have something that looks like this, object colon another object, that means that the first object in that the first object on the left is going to be inheriting values from the object on the right, whatever they are. That's all that means. Abstract classes and interfaces are very similar. An interface is just a completely abstract class, meaning that it's a class that's not implemented. There's no logic in there. It's a class that it's completely empty and only has the names of the methods. So there's no fields in there either. It's just methods only, the names and the type. An abstract class, on the other hand, can have abstract methods, which are empty methods, abstract fields, which are empty fields, and implemented methods and implemented fields, which are fields with logic and stuff in there. So an abstract class has a little bit more flexibility in the sense compared to an interface, but it's also very similar. That's the basic definition of what those are. So let's continue on to the real world example, or the one that I'm going to use to help explain interfaces and abstract classes a little bit better before I go into a more technical way, I guess. So an abstract class and interface are very similar, but they're very different as well. So an interface is to a signed contract, where an abstract class is to a contract's template. So let's say that you and a buddy are signing a contract. Once you sign on the dotted line, it is binding. You are expected to do whatever's on that contract, right? So the interface expects your object that inherits it to implement, aka add logic to fulfill the method's signature. So here's an example of an object inheriting from an interface that expects it to implement it. this example will tell you that the object is now implementing the method in that interface. And if it doesn't do that, it's gonna complain. The compiler will complain. In your abstract classes, it's a little bit more complicated. There's fields that don't have to be implemented, the ones that don't have the word abstract in it. So if it has abstract in it, it's just like the interfaces where the object is expected to override using the override keyword to implement that method within it. However, you could have non-abstract methods, the ones without that keyword, to be within the object, and the object can use it, but it doesn't have to implement it, doesn't have to override it in order for it to compile correctly. So here's an example of that. Here's an example of me going through the abstract class and then an object that is actually implementing the methods that need to be implemented. There's nothing too complex here, and honestly, that's really all there is to the abstract classes and interfaces. There's you can go into it more in depth when it comes to the syntax, but I believe that the next thing that they will ask you is the differences, the similarities, and when to use one or the other. So let's go through that first. The interfaces and abstract classes are different because abstract classes, an object can only inherit one instance of an abstract class. An interface can inherit, an object can inherit multiple interfaces. And you can even have abstract classes that inherit interfaces, strangely enough. Also, neither one can instantiate themselves as an object, basically. So you cannot do abstract x equals new abstract, or interface y equals new abstract new interface. My bad. You can't do something like that, but you can do something like abstract x equals new object that has is inheriting from that abstract class. So I should have an example here of that. What this is doing is not instantiating an abstract class. What this is doing is instantiating an object that is inheriting from that class, and the same can be done with interface. So I should have an example of that here, where it is the interface. It's an object that inherits an interface that's being instantiated instead. So just remember that difference. It's really important because that is the question that burned me. The question of, can you instantiate an abstract class or interface? You say no, and then they're gonna flip on you, say, then what's this and what's happening here? Then you have to say, I'm not instantiating the interface with the abstract class, I'm just instantiating an object that inherits from an abstract class or an interface. That's the most important thing in my opinion, is to understand that right there. And I'm just gonna go over the questions that you will be asked. So the syntax is not, I didn't go very syntax heavy on this video. I didn't find too much of a need to, and if you want more examples, there's plenty of it online. Instead, I'll just go over the questions that they'll ask you. I'm just gonna say, number one, what is polymorphism? It just means the same methods allowing you to perform different tasks. That's how I would answer that question if asked in an interview. Number two is the difference between an abstract and interface class. I'm going to give you 4 differences. Only one abstract class can be inherited by an object, while an object can have multiple interfaces. So one abstract per object, multiple interfaces per object. An abstract class can contain an implemented non-abstract members in it, while an interface cannot have that. Everything in the interface is abstract. It's all empty methods. There are no fields in the interface either, but you could have fields in an abstract class. Number 3 is both require their abstract members, so the methods or the fields, depending, to be implemented by the object that inherits them. So if you don't have the object actually implementing whatever the method is going to be, then it's going to cause an error, and that's the expectation. Neither one can instantiate an instance of an abstract or an interface, but you can instantiate an object that inherits from either one or the other, or whatever. When do you use an abstract? Use an abstract when some things are very similar. We have very similar objects. So an example is when you have a shape object and you have 2 shapes, circle and a square. You want to have the area being common between the two, but the way they will implement their areas are different. The circle has one way of implementing an area, while the square has a different way of implementing an area. However, you want both of them to have an area, and they are expected to have them because they're both shapes. An interface is more generic. So when you program, you are expected to have some sort of functions that are expected in the program. So objects will be able to share some functionality with each other, some basic functionality. especially if you're getting objects from like a database. Maybe you're expected to have IDs on them. So you want them all to have a way of getting the ID from that object. So you could say, I'm going to implement an interface that has a get ID function in there, but I want all my objects to have it because they're all coming from the database. They're all expected to have IDs, and my program expects it. So whatever the generic utility of that is for my program, I need to implement it, not implement, but I need to have an interface for it so that my objects can implement it. And that's how I would answer that. If there's a very, very generic scenario, such as IDs or other data types that might come from SQL or some other database that you're expecting many objects to have, or some category of objects to have. And that's really it. I believe that this covers abstract classes interfaces, and it covers this question specifically. This question is very often asked because it's such a fundamental component for C# programmers. So you must know this, and you will be asked this from time to time. It doesn't matter how much your skill level is or how much experience you are, you will keep getting asked this question over and over again as you go into your interviews. So don't be like me, actually study and actually understand this. You know what I mean? Or you might lose that 6-figure salary, and we don't want that. Anyways, that's the first of a series of videos like this. Hope you liked it. Let me know how I can improve, and I'll see you next time. I'll go back to the entertaining videos on the next one maybe. So I'll see you later. Contract Answer out.